Women can't get their sanitary products when they need to. They're put in men's clothing. They're asked to stitch men's underwear in some prisons in our country.
I was really looking forward to speaking to my guest this week. And it's one of those interviews that I have a feeling that is going to shift the way you see her specialist subject forever. It certainly has mine, because Lady Edwina Grosvenor has made it her life's mission, basically to shine a light into the darkest corner of the prison system. And it's one of those areas, I think, of society that we think often outside or out of mind. And it's a place most of us overlook and we don't understand. And what I loved about this interview is that Edwina, through her experience of 25 years, not expected, is it, as a lady or the goddaughter of Princess Diana, but yeah, she's been at this for 25 years and is using her voice and her resources and her relentless passion and her expertise to challenge the system, and to certainly challenge it for women in the prison system. And it's podcasts like this that I absolutely love sharing, because not only do we learn so much about what we should all know, but also we learn more about humanity and redemption and second chances and the chances of us being born into different types of families. And yet how somehow in the walls of a prison, those two worlds can collide and create a connection that sparks change. And I promise you that this is a conversation that's going to make you think differently about those in prison, women in prison, the unfairness towards women yet again, and Edwina's path of purpose and a hope of transforming lives that so need her help. I really hope you take so much from this podcast. Enjoy.
Bow your head and let your eyelids close on down. Where we're going, you won't need to bring your frown.
Hi, I'm Holly Tucker, and welcome to my podcast, Conversations of Inspiration. I've reached out to founders and those who simply inspire me to share their hard-earned wisdom with you. My hope is that collectively, these remarkable realizations will help you on your own journey. I like to think of it as inspiration for life. So let's begin this week's Conversation of Inspiration. This episode includes discussions about the deaths of babies, which may be distressing for some listeners. If you need to, please skip from minute 26 to minute 28. Take care while listening. Welcome to Conversations of Inspiration. It is an honour, Edwina, to be speaking to you today. How are you today?
I'm great. It's a little grey outside, but apart from that, I'm fine.
I believe you had a 13-year-old birthday party to contend with this weekend, which is fraught with nerves. I do remember. We were just saying it's that in-between age. It's still on the side of innocence.
Exactly.
But we are heading in a different direction.
Yeah, it's just the pressure, isn't it, to do something good and to be like the cool parents who can, give them what they want. Because when they're little, it's fine. You just go, here you go, here's a cake and a present, and put some horrendous music on, and they're sort of happy, usually playing with the wrapping paper as opposed to the present you've actually given them. But when they get to 13, it's a different ball game, isn't it?
It's a different ball game. It is.
But I think we managed to pull it off. We're all good. She was happy.
Well done. High five. This is when, forget kids and their reward stickers. Parents really, really should be clocking up some, and it's Monday morning, kids are at school, and we're able to have this conversation. So
exactly.
I'm really honoured. You're one of the leading thinkers and a woman who's devoted her entire career to prison reform. And I know you're going to be sharing some hugely important insights with us today. And it's such an important conversation. And I'm highly fascinated in women who have not been given the chances that so many of us have. And we need to hear about it. We need to educate ourselves about it. And so I'm really, really happy to be talking to you. Let's go right to the beginning, if that's okay. To the little Edwina, before the 13, we were just reflecting on sometimes actually the nightmare of getting teens and tweens is we actually start remembering what we were like. And we just pray that our children do not have that DNA. That's all I did with Harry. It's just, please say that you're from my husband's side, Catholic, quite innocent, rather than Holly Hurricane's
Holly
DNA.
Hurricane. I like that.
So I would love to talk about your experiences as a young Edwina. So you had a interesting, unique childhood. You grew up with your sisters and brothers on your family's Cheshire estate as part of a privileged aristocratic family. And your godmother was Princess Diana, and your parents were the Duke and Duchess of Westminster. And they were both very involved in charitable ventures. I was fascinated reading all about it, and served as patrons to dozens and dozens of charities over the years. Can you tell me about that work? And was that discussed around the breakfast table? Was that part of the air? And obviously you have a unique experience of being brought up that many of us don't understand. What was it like around the breakfast table?
Yeah, so it's interesting because it wasn't discussed like, the term philanthropy can be a bit problematic and, exclusive. But I will refer to philanthropy during this podcast, but it is sort of a slightly strange word.
Hard to say as well, and very hard to spell.
It's really hard to say, and I'm dyslexic and I can't spell it.
I'm dyslexic. Do not ask me to spell that.
But the conversations were more, my parents were kind. My father's not alive anymore, but my mother is. So parents were both, and my mother still is, they're generous people. My father cared very deeply about other people. He had a real social conscience, as did my mother. So it wasn't really talked about this thing that we should be doing because we're wealthy people. It was just absolutely part of life. And it's like, you need to understand what you have. You need to be aware of it. You need to be aware that other people will find it problematic. You need to understand, therefore, it wasn't quite you, therefore, need to understand how to behave around it. Mm-hmm. But, it was like, this is an active thing in your life that is real and you are going to have to navigate it. And so they were just constantly putting us back in our boxes and, very little pocket money actually compared to most of our friends. Absolutely you respect your elders. You sit in the back of the car. You stand up when grown-ups come in. So there was a level of like, I guess those old-fashioned manners, mm-hmm. but at the same time, just being very aware that what we have can and does make other people feel very uncomfortable. So crucially, how do you navigate that and how do you just cope with that as a child?
How have you navigated being in a privileged position? It's like you were born, when you opened your eyes, you didn't ask as much as anyone asked to be born into the situation that they're in. You found yourself in a very privileged position as someone else will find themselves in not a privileged position. This is not something you asked for as a baby, and you grew up to the magnificent woman that you are today. But I can imagine it has come with many judgments before you've even opened your mouth.
Yeah. And I think you've hit the nub of it, really. That's what got me fascinated in people. It's like, oh, right. So I've been born into this very nice family, a big house, and very privileged. And like, it's kind of extreme on the, I guess, the wealth side of it, but lovely. I'm certainly not complaining about that. But then, when I started working with people who are less fortunate, I was like, oh, wow. And these kids have been born maybe to two heroin users or people who are homeless and then you sort of think, God, that's so unfair because we're all really a product of who we are born to and where we are born and our circumstances. Mm. Now, it's not to say that we're all trapped in that. Mm-hmm. People can move beyond it and overcome things, but that can be terribly difficult for people. So I think from a really young age, I felt that injustice of the luck of birth or the unluck of birth, actually.
Yeah, and that really came to me this morning before talking to you. So let's go back to your parents. I read that when you were 12 or 13, your parents, and this sounds like them actually, took you to meet heroin addicts at a rehabilitation centre for drug addicts. And that not long after that, you did work experience at a homeless shelter. Do you remember how those experiences impacted you?
Oh, yes.
Because it's a very impressionable age. We've just been talking about your daughter. And has that stayed with you almost for life?
Absolutely. 100%. I can feel, I remember walking down Hope Street in Liverpool. I've got a real thing about doorways.
Okay.
And doorways in my life with significant moments. It's a strange thing, the symbolism behind that you can look into if you're interested in doorways. But anyway, I remember the door and I remember going in, and I remember not quite what the couple looks like that we were talking to, these two heroin users in the drug rehabilitation clinic on Hope Street that day. But it was a man and a woman, and they were just very open, and they were happy to talk to us about the trials and tribulations of where they sort of found themselves, how they'd got there. I remember, and I still feel that even talking about it, just like that excitement to hear it and feeling, it's not like some weird macabre excitement hearing someone talking about their heroin addiction. I don't mean that. But I mean, I was just so fascinated. I was so pleased that they wanted to talk about it because, we lived in a household where everything was talked about. And so as a result, I'm a real talker and I'm really open with my children. And I think things are better discussed and talked about no matter how hard they are.
Yeah.
So I was like lapping it up, and everything they told me, I was just so fascinated in. And, and the reason our parents wanted us to go was because we were going to grow up. They knew, we didn't. We were just born into the family we were born in, and we were kids. And we were like, this is normal.
Yeah.
We didn't realize it wasn't that normal.
Yeah.
And our parents were like, God, drugs. We want to be able to educate them away from drugs. How do we do that? We're probably not the best people to do it. Maybe some people who really know what they're talking about should do it. And a lot of people, I imagine at the time, their friends thought they were mad. But it was just totally incredible. And I grew up with a very different view on drugs. It was like, people are going to do them. That's kind of individual choice. And I'm not going to sit there as being all judgy about it, but I very much was like, absolutely not. No, just absolutely not interested. And no matter how many people tried to convince me otherwise, and to be fair, there weren't that many, I was just like, it's not glamorous, it's not cool. I can see where it can end.
Can lead to.
Yeah, I can see where it might end up for you. And obviously there's all different types of drugs. Heroin being a class A drug, it's quite extreme when you're talking about injecting heroin compared to smoking a bit of weed. But as these two people very much wanted us to know, you don't just jump to injecting heroin.
Yeah.
Pot, cannabis, smoking weed, gateway drug. So now it's not to say that everyone who smokes weed is going to start injecting heroin, but I think it all comes back to education, which I think we'll be talking a lot about in this podcast, and misunderstanding and making sure that we do understand these things and just looking at the whole picture and not just don't do drugs, it's bad. It's like, why? What's the story behind that? What's the narrative, And I felt like I got so much of that, and I felt it was like a springboard onto everything else. And now I look back and I've opened a place called Hope Street, which obviously is directly because of being on Hope Street when I was like 13.
That moment. So we're going to go through, so how was childhood in terms of schooling? You were being exposed, thanks to your parents, to these lessons, I suppose, that they wanted to give you on the outside of your world, but the inside of your world, going through, and I'm almost capturing this part of the podcast up until your gap year. What was that like? Were you academic? I read that you did have, of course, an extraordinary sort of life as well as the daughter of the Duke and Duchess. One of your teachers asked how much ransom there might be if you were kidnapped, which is not a normal question,
No.
Certainly. Did you wear that cloak throughout your schooling? That sort of that side of things?
So, teacher, and I remember who the teachers were. I remember what they looked like, and I liked a lot of them. They were perfectly nice people, but occasionally they said really odd things. And that stood me in good stead for the rest of my life, with people saying quite odd things, coming back to that. I can make people uncomfortable or nervous just because of who I am and I guess what my family stands for, or I don't know, the unsaid stuff. And it does make people sometimes behave quite strangely. But, I also think when you're at school, you're either too tall, you're too short, you're too fat, you're too thin, you're too rich, you're too poor, you're too spotty, you're too pretty. So I don't see it as any kind of like, oh, poor me. I was just like, well, the person with the red hair is getting all sorts of grief today. And, so really I didn't see it as any other. It was kind of annoying. I do remember saying to one teacher, if I didn't have any money, I'm not sure you'd be taking the mick out of me.
Really?
Because that wouldn't be acceptable.
Wow.
So it's kind of like...
How old were you then?
Quite young. So teenage years, definitely between the ages of 13 and, 17, somewhere in amongst that age. I do think that is such a powerful, impressionable age. And I just learned that actually you have to stand up for yourself and you have to say it. But crucially, you can be polite and you can make your point. And that's something that I've always carried with me, because the prison world and the criminal justice world, it's battle, 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 battle. It's about sort of hustling and trying to get the things that you want done. And I'm a big believer in you forge ahead, you fight, and you can get your own way, but you have to be polite and sort of keep your manners. And that might sound really ridiculous.
No.
But you can't just keep getting angry and losing your head and shouting. It's not my nature anyway.
Yeah.
And then often you're much more effective because people like you and want to work with you.
In your way, you started working that muscle that you work now from a young age, fending off things that really, as you said, other people weren't experiencing. And we're going to go through now to this moment where I can't quite believe you did this. When other people are going off to gap years, traveling around, hanging out. I didn't do one. I wish I bloody well had.
Still time, Ollie.
Oh, gosh, God, this is going to be a good gap year, though. No, I'm not sleeping in any tents, that's for sure. So for those, gap year came along and you travelled to Nepal, where you spent a year working in a prison in Kathmandu. And this marked the start of your journey with prison philanthropy. Just when you were signing up to do a gap year, and everyone else was just going to go and be a waitress in wherever, and you were going to Kathmandu to work in a prison. Just before I ask you about that experience, how did you manage to do that?
Well, it was part of my gap year, not all of it, but it sort of was long enough, to be honest. So I remember the discussion with my parents and I remember distinctly saying this, I want to be out of my comfort zone for a part of it because I don't think I can do the whole thing just floating around. I've never been very good pootling around without a reason or without a thing to be doing or working towards. And I get bored quite quickly. So I remember my father saying, what about a refugee camp and I was like, I don't think that's it. And, I'm certainly not like a nurse or a doctor. I wasn't that way inclined. Don't really like blood. Wouldn't be very good at sort of injuries. So I kind of knew what I didn't want to do. And then I was talking to some friends at school and a friend of mine said, my stepmother runs a prison assistance missionary in Kathmandu. And I was like, those words sound really exciting. I'm not entirely sure what they all mean.
Sign me up.
Yeah. So she was like, well, my stepmother lives in Herefordshire. Why don't you go and have a chat with her? So I was like, all right. So I lived in Cheshire at the time. I went and saw my friend's stepmother and we had a chat and she said, great, well, look, there's a charity out there and go out. And so my plan was to be in Kathmandu to work for one charity. That fell through because something happened to a child. There was something strange that went on. So she said, no, actually, there's a new charity that's just opened that could really do with your help. It's down on the border of India and Nepal. So down in the flats of Nepal. And actually, it's also a prison assistance missionary. And there's young children who will have been brought out of prison that you'll be looking after on a sort of day-to-day basis and then taking them back to the prison as and when. So I went down there, but I spent a couple of weeks in Kathmandu first, and I was in and out of central jail in Kathmandu, and then went down to the borders to look after these 4 little boys who'd come out of a provincial prison in the Himalayas. The walls were made of mud, so every time there was a monsoon, the inmates just scratched the wall down and got out, and then they'd get rounded up again and put back in the prison. They'd build the walls again with the mud. And then the next year, the monsoons would come. Anyway.
So you were 18 years old when you went out there. And this is where you sort of started, I suppose, the passion that you have with prisons. And you came back after returning and you graduated in criminology and you began working for women offenders and their children. In your experience, are there certain characteristics that are shared between the prisons that you've visited, and what are those?
Do you mean around the world?
Yeah, around the world.
Sort of, there's the global thematic landscape, if you like, for women going into prisons is domestic violence, interpersonal sexual violence, then the sort of low-level crime, the acquisitive crime, often, and I will point out, it's a generalization, but it's the statistics speak for themselves. There is usually, with a woman, a male behind the offending, whether that's a gang member, a pimp, women are often drug mules, an abusive partner. These things are quite usual to see sitting behind female offending. Whereas when you look at a man, you don't usually see a female gang member, a female pimp, a female abusive partner in the background. Now, yes, of course, things always buck the trend, and there are plenty of men who suffer from domestic violence, but it's still sort of not really talked about in the way that it is the other way around. So, so we see that from South Africa to England to Sri Lanka, women ending up in prison because of these gendered roles that we have and what it is to be a woman. And as I said, whether it's sort of prostitution, drug muling, domestic violence, drugs, there's a very common pattern. And interestingly, the global prison population for women sits at around 4 or 5% globally. And the prison population for women in England and Wales is 4%, which I also think is quite interesting.
4% of
the entire prison population. So it's at 97% male.
This is what everyone will find interesting, and I'm sure you're nodding away, listener, is that when was the last time you thought about, or have you ever thought about women in prison? And have you ever thought about how many women are in prison and why are they in prison? I think we hear, when we see, and we're going to talk about the prisons and the crisis now, but when we see it on the news and we see everything, it's just men. It's always men, isn't it? That's actually continuously what you see. So you just don't even think about women in prison and what that life must be. And has a prison ever been thought about to being made for a woman? Let's go into the crisis. Some of the worst prisons that you visited. So you've got the sort of inmates and what that's like, but the actual prisons themselves, are there characteristics that are shared there, or are all prisons incredibly different? So I'm thinking leadership, the environment, or is it very much to do with the country that it's in? You just talked about mud walls.
Yeah.
Obviously, our prisons aren't made out of mud walls.
No.
But what have you seen there? Or is it very vastly different?
They're very different in the different countries you go into. As you said, you've got the extremes of the third world prisons and mud walls in sort of very rural areas of the Himalayan mountain range in Nepal, compared to a women's prison that I've been to in New York, for example, which looks much more like a traditional lock 'em up, kind of bang up prison. There are 12 women's prisons in England. And I stop at saying Wales because we don't have a women's prison in Wales. So it's just England. And then the Scottish prison service sits separately, as does the Irish one. So we have 12 women's prisons in England. And there's about 130 prisons altogether in this country. So it is, a small proportion. And of those women, most of them are in for short sentences because their crimes are less serious. It's not uncommon for a woman to serve a couple of days in prison or a week.
Yeah.
It's a waste of money. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of everything. Nothing useful can be done with the woman in that time. But it is enough time, of course, for everything to unravel. So because women globally are usually the primary carers,
yes,
what then happens when a woman goes into prison and everyone kind of thinks, and actually this was a misconception in Nepal that I found very interesting. Everyone kind of thought with those sort of Indian Nepalese families that the family would then take on the children.
Yes.
Well, no, because you brought disgrace upon the household. So absolutely not. So the children went to prison with the women, certainly in Nepal when I was there, which is why the organisation that I worked for,
which is why you were there,
why we took the children out of the prison so that we could feed them, educate them and give them what they needed. And then we'd take them back into the prison to visit their mothers. So that's another sort of area of female imprisonment. And, and I would also like to point out, which I feel like I always have to do, and it's kind of annoying, we don't talk about women's imprisonment at the detriment of men. And I've been interviewed a couple of times on the radio about this, and the sort of media narrative sort of, you can feel it eking in. It's like, oh, so we should lock up all the men and let all the women out, should we? And I have to take a deep breath and I go, no, because that would be ridiculous. Obviously, no one with half a brain cell is saying that. But what we are saying is that on the whole, men are more violent. There are many more men in prison, as I said, the 96% versus the 4%. Men typically, their routes into prison are very, very different, and it's more tricky, it's more violent, it's more, the men will get on the roof of the prisons, they'll riot, they'll fight, they'll make the headlines. The women don't, and because they tend to turn their violence inwards and self-harm and hurt themselves and beat themselves up, they tend to suffer in silence. And because they're the minority, and because the prison service was designed by men for men. Now, I don't say that as a whinge or to be defensive. It's just true, which is also why women can't get their sanitary products when they need to. It's why they're put in men's clothing. It's why they're asked to stitch men's underwear, by the way, in some prisons in our country. And imagine if you've been the survivor of sexual abuse and actually your job that day is to stitch men's underwear to send it to the male prisons. And actually, when it comes to pregnancy in prison, only recently, after the death of high-profile deaths of 2 babies, only then did statutory maternity care come into prisons. That was in 2021.
And what do you mean by that?
You just did the eye thing that everyone does.
Yes.
when I say some of the things that I say. And I'm always very careful, because when I say it and I get people's reaction, like yours, which is so sort of familiar to me, I do sort of sometimes go, I better keep checking my stats and my facts.
I know, yeah.
I work in prisons, right? So, and I work with people who've come out of prison like day in, day out. So I know this to be true, but because it is so unbelievable, I do sometimes I go, am I making that up? But no, it's true. So there was a death of a baby in 2021. I talked about this on the radio the other day. The lady in question was an 18-year-old care leaver. She came into prison on remand, heavily pregnant. So that means she was serving time but awaiting her sentence.
Yep.
So she was waiting to be found guilty or not guilty. She went into labour. She pressed her alarm bell. No one came. She pressed her alarm bell. No one came. No one came. No one came. All night, no one came. She gave birth to her baby. The details of it, I'm not going to say because it's really distressing, and sometimes I've said it and upset people, but it is, you can find it online. The baby did die in her cell. They were both alone, and she wrapped the baby up and got into her cell bed. And then finally, the next morning, a prison officer came in to find the scene. She was then found not guilty, and she was free to go. And she wasn't on a mother and baby unit. She'd grown up in care.
Yeah. So
that happened. Then another baby died in Style prison about 6 months later. Similar circumstances, very upsetting. And then they thought it would be a good idea to maybe look at it.
It's just absolutely shocking. I mean, it's just I'm actually lost for words. I do understand though when you said is why it's so important, Edwina, what you're doing and how you are and who you are, that we're all listening to you, we're relating to you, the way you're coming across and bringing this information to us, we can absorb it. And actually why you feel like, hang on a minute, is this right? Keep checking yourself, because actually it's so ridiculous what you're actually saying in 2024 that you're checking yourself. And in a totally different subject, I do the same when talking about women in business. And talking about just recently, 2% of all money, VC money, goes to women. So 98% of all venture capital goes to men. And so actually, when you think about women and they normally build businesses looking at society or looking at issues within a woman's world and all these sorts of things. And I too feel myself going, have I just made that up again?
Yeah.
But it's absolutely ridiculous. And that these are extreme numbers that we're talking about. And yet because there's not enough of us talking about it. It's for a few, we have to deliver these implausible numbers, and people roll their eyes or look at you going, surely that's not right.
Yeah. I listened to a radio phone-in on, I think it was on LBC, and the interviewer was talking about the baby that I just mentioned. And the guy, I laugh, it's not funny, but he just went, I just don't believe that happened. I'm sorry, I just don't believe it. And the interviewer was like, no, there was an inquest. Like, we're not having debate over whether this happened or not. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting there going, oh my God, actually, it was a really important thing for me to hear, because I was like, yeah, maybe that's why people don't connect.
Yes.
Because it's too unbelievable.
It's too unbelievable. We've spoken about those that go in, women that go in. We've talked about the walls around them. Talk about what goes on inside. You spoke about self-harm. You spoke about this abuse that, you spoke about these things that women have contended with in their lives and find themselves in prison. But you've also said that some of your most magical moments of your life have happened in prison, that there's something about prisons that cuts through everything else. And I read that someone connected with you after your father died. And would you mind sharing that story? Because I think this is, we've talked about the violence there, and we've talked about the injustice. But is there a camaraderie? Is there something that happens that why you would say that some of your most magical moments have happened within this, what seems to be an alien, cold, terrible environment?
Yeah, it's probably like working in any extreme environment, I would imagine. I don't know, because I've only worked in this one. But the highs are very high and the lows are very low. So it makes the opposite even more accentuated, if that makes sense. Yes, for a long time, my organisation, One Small Thing, we were training prison officers, and we were getting the women themselves trained up to be able to run interventions about trauma, to get them to understand their trauma. So I was doing a focus group with the women. And it was soon after my father had died. The emotions are always crackling and running high, particularly in women's prisons, because women don't hide as much. They wear their emotions much more out there, whereas the men are much more guarded, and it's game face. Anyway, I came out of the room that a few people had got a bit upset, as is usual, and I sort of came out onto the wing, and I was like, that was heavy. And I saw a woman, a female prisoner who I recognised, and we had a chat, and she said, how are you? Because it had been in the paper that my father had died and what had happened. He'd had a sudden heart attack. And she said, oh, my father died as well. I can't remember what she said about the circumstances, but she said, I know how hard it is. I still think about him every day. And just said, just some really nice things to me, and then just gave me a massive hug. And I remember standing there on the wing of that prison thinking, this is what it's all about. This is amazing. Whether she knew who I was, it doesn't matter. It didn't matter. Because actually when you're in a prison, the outside world sort of almost, and this is interesting, because the outside world ceases to exist, really.
Right.
You don't take, literally, you don't take your phone in, so you're disconnected.
Yes.
Then you're in the walls, and you feel like the outside doesn't exist. And actually, that's what it feels like when you're on the outside. Most people don't think
of the inside.
Because it doesn't really exist.
Yes, I think you're right.
And I think until we find a way, and as you were saying, I do speak on this a lot. Only recently have I started speaking on the radio and in the media, because I've always been slightly reticent to do that. It's not my natural habitat.
Well, you're very good at it.
I'd rather be in a prison. But I do speak publicly a lot, but I'll speak to, random community groups, and I'll speak at conferences and in my own world. But then in my organisation and with my chief executive, we talk a lot about trying not to speak into the echo chambers, because that's kind of a waste of time. The people who get it, get it.
Yeah.
We need to be speaking in the forums and to the audiences.
To the man who says, absolutely, I don't believe that would have happened, and there's been an inquest.
Exactly. And the other day, I was listening to another really well-respected journalist just simply couldn't believe that women are given tents when they leave prisons.
I can't believe that.
And they are given tents because they're homeless. And again, I reflect with my colleagues, and we're like, Do you sometimes feel like you're actually going mad because you've been saying it consistently for 20 years, and then even very well respected, intelligent journalists who, they know a lot about a lot because they all day long they're
consuming
looking at and consuming information, and you're like, God, this is really weird.
Since I was a child, I've always been curious about art, passionate about trying new things, and fascinated by finding new ways to express myself. And since setting up my first business, Not on the High Street, my vision has always been to create a world in which someone, just like you or I, can be creatively inspired. Whether that be through a podcast like this one, by helping you turn your dreams into a business, or to enjoy shopping for thoughtful, never-seen-before finds that take you in a new direction or help you show the world how you feel. When I discovered the small business community, it felt like I'd come home. Here are people who can translate emotions into objects, people who can conceive of things we never could and have talent beyond our wildest imaginations. That's why I set up Holly & Co, to bring them all together as a collective, to support each other and to help you become the person you've always wanted to be. I've handpicked them all so we have skills in all areas, from embroiderers and bakers to glass etchers and paperbird makers, so that you too can learn the rich stories behind each one. For me, it's a dream come true, and I hope it inspires you too. Visit holly.co to find out more. Now, back to our conversation of inspiration. You just mentioned you've been 20 years, you've been advocating for change. And I think most people might be switched on or turned thinking about prisons because of the news this summer, where thousands of prisoners were released early because of overcrowding, and scenes of people being greeted at the prison gates with champagne being popped. What's your point of view on that? And is it a bomb that's been waiting to go off for a while? Are we in crisis? And this is really about all prisons.
Totally. So the prison population has increased by 93% in the last 30 years. For as long as I have worked in prisons, which is 25 years this year, we have absolutely been expecting this. People, I've grown up in this world.
Yes.
I became an adult in this world. And so all the people who are older than me, who I've respected, colleagues, have been saying this day in, day out, categorically, for 2 decades. So it is the most predictable, most annoying, frustrating. There's victims of crime out there. I always say to people, look, no matter what your political persuasions or your views on any of this, we are all the same in the fact that we want our communities to be safer and we want less victims.
Yes.
I don't think there's one person on the planet that would disagree with that statement.
Absolutely.
So we're not like a group of weirdos who just really like prisoners and think that violence is fine. Do you know what I mean? It's like we, the experts, are working towards a more sensible system because we want safer communities and because we want less victims.
Yes.
And it's funny because occasionally you get the comments like, if I say something, well, what about the victims though? And you're like, well, of course, but then you realize it's like, okay, we need to get more sophisticated in how we're talking about it, because what we think is obvious
is obviously not obvious.
It's obviously not obvious. So I have to say, of course, the men matter. The overcrowding crisis in the male estate is far more acute. The conditions are far worse. An urgent notification requirement has just been put on Manchester male prison. It has never seen the levels of violence. It's never been so dirty. Self-harm and suicide is at a historic high across male and female prisons. But the point is, the problem with the men is far bigger because of the numbers. And we shouldn't just ignore the women because there's bigger numbers with the men and because they're more violent. And actually, if you're looking to reduce the capacity of the estate, if you're looking to find ways to bring that number down, well, yes, we can talk about the men too, because there'll be men in on short sentences that actually aren't very violent men. But let's talk about the 85% of women who are in prison on short sentences and they're in for non-violent crimes. Now, it's not to say, obviously, it's not to say that people shouldn't be punished for what they do. That should always be the judge's job, the magistrate's job, to make that judgment, because that is their qualification, that is what they're there to do. But we need to be sensible. We have a finite number of beds. We have a probation service. Community justice used to work quite well in this country. It doesn't anymore because all the money's been pulled out of it. It was privatised, then it was renationalised. So it's undergone a really, really difficult time. So actually what we need to do is start investing in community justice solutions, because we can't just lock up all the people we're mad at.
Yeah.
Because there's no room. And, you know, when you look at those walls and you look at the level of security and you look at the barbed wire and the prison officers and the keys and the metal gates and being kept in a cell, fine. For the people who are incredibly dangerous and we need to be protected from, I actually have no issue with that.
Yeah.
But do we want that 18-year-old care leaver who's on remand who gets found not guilty? Because, by the way, 82% of women who go into prison on remand get found not guilty. So they've already served a prison sentence, but then they get found not guilty.
Remind us of a remand. We're not au fait with the language.
So that's what I was going to say. It sounds like I'm getting technical. I'm not. So say you, Holly, ended up in front of a magistrate because you'd broken a window in a shopping mall and you were drunk and all the rest of it. And the magistrate says, oh, God, okay, actually for Holly, yes, you're being a pain, actually, antisocial behaviour and all the rest of it, but it doesn't cross the custody threshold, meaning you don't really need to go to, I don't want to send you to prison for that because you're just being a pain. Right, I would like to give you a community sentence. What's your address? And you might say, well, I'm homeless. And the magistrate's like, well, I can't give you a community sentence if you're homeless, so I'm going to have to send you to prison. So you get up tariff to prison because you're homeless. So then a magistrate might say, well, hold on, I'll have a look around the county and I'll see if there's a safe place for you to be able to be tagged to. To be electronically tagged, like the thing around your ankle, but you need an address. Okay. Oh, well, there aren't any places in this county where you can be safe and have a bed and do your community sentence from. So I'm going to have to send you to prison. Or the magistrate might say, you do have a home. And you say, well, I'm afraid there's domestic violence in the background. So then the magistrate's not going to give you a home detention curfew and tag you to your home.
Yes.
If you're the victim of domestic violence. So if the magistrate can't find another safe bed for you in the county where maybe you could go with you're going to prison.
I'm going to prison.
So there's a huge chunk. And this is where it really matters, because this is what happens to women, usually. This is not what happens to men, usually.
And why is there the difference?
Because there's a lot more services for men, because there's a lot more men.
Yes.
And domestic violence for women, I'd say of the women we work with at Hope Street, I would say it's 100%. If it's not 100%, it's 99%. It's just a given. Women will come with some sort of tricky man in the background that is sort of involved with her somehow, because women are usually abused by the person to whom they say, I love you. Men are not.
Yes.
And again, that really matters, because with women, it's relational. With men, it's less relational. You know, the violence with men tends to be more peer on peer. It's like gang related. It's not in those sort of interpersonal and sexual relationships, usually.
To give an idea, in our country, what sort of numbers? We know that 94% of the prison community is female. What sort of number is that?
So the prison population, so 4% of women in prison, of the total, are women, and that's around 3,800.
So 3,800 women are in prison. And out of that, I know you might not have the statistics, you have it for Hope Street, nearly 100%. But out of that, what would you roughly say has been within one of these relationships?
Oh, well over 80%.
So over 80% of those people?
Yeah. If people are interested, the best source to go to for these stats, which we all have as the Bible, is the Bromley briefings that are produced by the Prison Reform Trust. And they have a chapter on children in prison. They have a chapter on women in prison. All the statistics are there. So if anyone is disbelieving anything that I say because it sounds mad, Bromley Briefings.
Bromley Briefings, which is the Bible of these statistics.
Yeah, produced by the Prison Reform Trust.
Are you now, so we see James Timpson has become the Minister of Prisons, which is fantastic. I interviewed Sir John Timpson on this podcast, and we spoke at length actually about the ex-offenders that Timpson's as a brand has given a chance to. And are you hopeful knowing that someone with hands-on experience will be leading the charge? I mean, we wish actually many ministers had actually hands-on experience in their areas leading their charge, but he does. Are you hopeful with this?
Yeah, it's a welcome relief, if nothing else, that someone with experience and a passion for this area is in the job, because it's a very different thing, isn't it? When someone knows it, they're passionate about it. He's only in this.
Well, you're not trying to persuade someone. They're not disbelieving your statistics, just to start with.
Well, yeah. And, he's not interested in becoming a politician. He really is a guy who knows and cares about this area. So that's great. He has got, I think, lots of interesting ideas of what he wants to get done. I think the size of the mountain that needs to be climbed is quite high. I think there's great expectation on him.
Yes, I can imagine.
But I think we need to be realistic about what he can achieve, because we need to remember that it's the civil servants that are the gatekeepers to progress or lack of. And I've seen that over 25 years of my career with different prisons ministers. I've known most of them. And if the civil servants don't want something to happen, let me tell you, it doesn't happen.
Right.
It's as simple as that, if I'm going to be honest. So I hope, because there's some brilliant civil servants that I've worked with over my career and continue to, but when I have been scratching my head going, I don't understand why we can't get this thing done. We've brought the money. We're going to do the work. There is going to be absolutely no cost to anyone apart from us just bringing an amazing workforce and more money into the prison system. Why are we hitting this kind of like opaque smoke and mirrors brick wall where there's nobody there blocking it that you can see, but it feels like there's a force that is just going to not let you succeed.
Christ.
Yeah. So
Christ.
he knows about.
Yeah. And let's hope that with the awareness that hopefully is increasing, people like you now speaking and getting out there and saying these things, and this entire podcast now hearing these statistics, and with him and with that genuine passion for change, that this might be the thing that tips it. And we were talking before this podcast started about looking at prisons and people that are within prisons with a different lens. And as you know, I've interviewed Katie Emp, who founded the Fine Cell Work. And that was the start of shifting my perception, if I'm honest with you. I hadn't ever, as you said, on the outside, you don't think about anything on the inside except keeping safe, and you don't even worry your little self about what that actually means and if it actually is working and if anyone is concentrating on the system. And she spoke about prisoners, encouraging them, for those who don't know Fine Cell Work, about embracing their creativity. And they do this amazing, actually they sell on Holly & Co, amazing cushions where they've taught them embroidery, these men, teaching them embroidery and the skills for basically having skills outside of prison. And they run a post-prison, what am I talking about?
After they've been released.
Yes, after they've been released. Groups. Yeah. And I think it's something like 90% of anyone that goes into those groups do not reoffend. So it's amazing. And this brings me to your fantastic work, founding investor and ambassador for The Clink, a charity which aims to cut reoffending rates, re-educate prisoners, equip them with the skills and qualifications that they need once they have been badged as a ex-offender, which I can only imagine what that does to your life the moment you have that title. So it's the first restaurant at HMP Highdown, opened its doors in 2009, offenders were given training in food preparation, food service, and customer service. Tell us about the story behind the clink and how it works and the successfulness of that reoffending statistic.
Yeah, so gosh, 2009, that was a long time ago, wasn't it? It'd taken me back. So basically, there was a prison officer, he was a prison chef, a man called Al Krishke, who came up with this idea. I knew him quite well, and he was like, there's no reason why we can't open a fine dining restaurant inside a prison. My men cook well. They've got, some of them have got a really great attitude. It's something that's very useful for them to know for themselves, their families, but then they can also get employment through it. And he said, I would like to build a fine dining restaurant inside the walls of a prison. So I was like, me and a couple of other people were like, okay, Al, great idea. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he said, would you invest in it, Edwina? I was like, if you find 4 other people to put the money in, I'm not going to go in alone, then I will. And he beetled off. He came back. He'd found other people as mad as I was to put some money in. So we all did. And fast forward to the opening day, the restaurant got built. There was a forward-thinking governor. And I remember the governor standing up at the opening of this restaurant inside the walls of HMP Highdown. And he said, if we'd gone to the Ministry of Justice and asked for permission, they never would have said yes. But sometimes it's better to ask for forgiveness as opposed to permission. So that's how the first one got open. But, to give your listeners a bit of an idea for those who haven't heard of it, it is fine dining. And you walk in, it's ambient light, sort of music, glass tables, private dining room, a sort of open bar kitchen, so you can see the men working behind. The pasta's made from scratch. The sauces are made from scratch. The fish come in whole and then are deboned. So it's not just like low-end food. This is like they really leave with good qualifications. They can get good jobs in good places. I'll never forget the chief executive at the time, Chris Moore, who was there for quite a number of years. And when he talks about how he tries to convince people to take the men on from prison, when someone goes, well, why would I take someone from prison? And Chris is like, why would you just take someone from the street? Because everyone knows you can walk into an interview and lie.
Yeah. You're right.
You can say whatever you want. He was like, I can tell you everything about these men. I can tell you how they've behaved in the last 5 years.
Yes.
I can tell you basically anything you want to know. Because if you take someone off the street, God knows what they could have done.
Yeah.
So you're not mitigating the risk by not taking people from prison. In fact, he managed to convince people, rightly, that there was less of a risk.
And I read it was in 2023, so it would have increased by now, that the clink had trained 830 students in prisons around the UK, delivered 550 NVQ qualifications, and placed half of the students into employment.
Yeah.
Which is just unbelievable, because this reoffending, so reoffending, because I can imagine reoffending because you're basically going out of prison, you're going maybe back into the situation that you were in before. And this idea that actually the chance for these people is to change, to go back to a life that is not the same. Would you say that you believe, and I'm assuming not for those who are violent, commit crimes that need to be, as you said, not within society, but do you believe after 25 years that you deserve a second chance?
Yeah, I think, look, anyone, even if they have committed a violent crime. So I used to work with male lifers. So most of them had committed murder, or it was a big drugs case. And some people had ended up murdering someone, for example, that they'd found doing something untoward to a family member.
Mm-hmm.
And then you find that people go, oh, well, I can understand that. So there is this sort of funny line of what is acceptable in people's eyes when it comes to murder and how that happens and the events leading up to it. And I think that is something that people are very scared to talk about as well, because a lot of people say, well, murder is murder. Taking a life is taking a life. And it's like, well, is it? Because the person who pushes the button on the electric chair, or the person who kills in war, compared to the person who kills indiscriminately someone who's walking across a park at night, compared to euthanasia, perhaps, compared to, and you could go on. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because I have worked with lots of people who have killed people. So therefore, if someone decides that they want to put a disastrous life behind them and they really do want to make a change, should we, and this is a question, because I'm not going to say this is how we should all think, because that's not for me to do, should we be helping people to lead a better life, or should we be actively preventing it? And I think that's a choice that the sort of, without sounding too grand, the sort of country needs to make. What is our prison service for? Is it to actively help those who want to make a change, or is it to prevent? Because at the moment, I would say we're now, when I started 25 years ago, lots of really incredible stuff happened in prisons. That they were a hotbed of charities coming in and out, music and theatre. That's all dying off at the minute.
Right.
There's something strange happening where funding's being pulled out of charities left, right and centre. The Clink has had funding pulled. We've had funding pulled. There's sort of, again, the dark forces are at play. We'll get to the bottom of it. But you sort of think someone needs to get a grip in government and say, this is what prison is for. And it's not really up for debate. Prison is there in order to make people come out more likely to lead a crime-free life. And we can all agree that that will make our communities safer and it will reduce the number of victims.
It's one of those subjects that lots of people will have their thoughts on, or potentially not even thoughts. It's an instant reaction. You know, you have an instant reaction to something. And you've probably, if you were really honest, listeners, when's the last time that you really had a good deep think about how you would like the prisoners to be treated, or what are the statistics? And how, you know, when you listen to, there's 3,800 women in prison and 80% of them have come from a male-controlled or abusive relationship. And is that just coincidence, anyone? Or would we say that absolutely will be causing the life that these women then lead? Potentially then when you look at men, what is the background of all these men? And I'm again not talking about, child molestation and all of these sorts of things. There is I personally, I'm sure you're not. We're not talking about those sorts of things, but we are asking this simple sort of umbrella question, which is, what is it? Is it to pack people into cells, and throw away the key, and then that doesn't become your problem? But prisons get overcrowded, and so what are you meant to do? So build more. So just build more and put more people in.
Yeah.
And until when? What happens? It's a bit like what happens then?
Well, I tell you what happens. What happened the other day and what's going to happen in a couple of weeks. You just have to let people out.
Yeah.
That's what happens, because we've reached that point. There is no more room. And because of the riots that happened in the summer, there's even less room. But what I was going to say was someone who I worked with came up with this quote, which I think is great, if I can get it out in the right order. Do we want our prisons to be warehouses for the incorrigible, or greenhouses for the redeemable?
Wow.
I said it right.
Well done. I know it's always good
to say. Thank you.
Please come out in the right order there.
But it's great, isn't it? Warehouses for the incorrigible, or greenhouses for the redeemable. And it really is for us to have to say, because you were also talking about prisoners, and I was giving a speech the other day to a group of people, and this term prisoners is really problematic, because you're talking about someone who's innocent who gets found not guilty, who is a prisoner. And then you're talking about someone like Wayne Couzens, who killed Sarah Everard.
Yes.
Who was a predatory, dangerous man.
Shouldn't have the same name.
And you're also talking about, I worked with a 22-year-old girl who looked at Google Maps on her mobile phone and accidentally hit someone who crossed the road in front of her. She went to prison. And you're talking about your child abusers, your paedophiles, so this term prisoners is like a really, of course, that's the term we give to people who are inside the walls. So it does help us to differentiate. But then if our policies and our laws and our legislation is drawn up thinking about prisoners.
No wonder then that everyone's treated with the same.
Yes, which is why women's prisons are designed architecturally to be male category A, B prisons, which is higher security, because if they need to be re-rolled, then the men can come in there and they don't have to adapt it. So what you have then is a load of low-risk, non-violent women in prisons that are designed
for your worst offenders,
for high-security men.
Well, this brings me on to your. It's every single. It feels like every answer is news to us. And this is why this podcast is so important. I wanted to speak to you about you again with One Small Thing, a charity you founded in 2014, basically with a mission to redesign the justice system and for women and children, because this is what we're talking about here. That its core focus is compassion and empathy for women that have been through trauma. And I know that One Small Thing was set up basically in response to these high levels of suicide that you've mentioned, self-harm across women's prisons, and the feedback from prison staff who wanted to better understand how they were to respond to this. And you were inspired by a trip to California with the prisons that you visited. Tell me about what you saw there and why this led to One Small Thing.
Yeah, so you summed it up really nicely. And basically with prison officers, they're not taught, and very few people, even in mental health services and drug and alcohol services, the underlying trauma isn't really talked about. So therefore, if it's not talked about, it's not really known about. So it's certainly therefore not addressed. So a lady called Dr. Stephanie Covington was sort of really at the forefront of the gender-specific trauma-informed work in America. And what the piece of work does is you go in and you train the prison officers to understand trauma. The gender-specific nature is what I alluded to earlier, which is if women are traumatized generally by men and it's interpersonal, it's sexual, it's in relationships, the trauma that men suffer has to also be treated differently and looked at through the lens of men for men.
Mm-hmm.
And it's different.
Yes.
And then the way people manifest that trauma, which comes out usually as violent behavior as a result of the trauma suffered, the way women exhibit that is different to how the men exhibit that. So if you're a prison officer working in a women's prison, you need to know some different stuff to what happens in the male prisons. And often prison officers get moved between male and female prisons, but guess what? They only get the training to look after the men. And so only recently has the gender-specific part been put into officer training. I sat on a board advising the government for quite a few years, and I remember when I was setting One Small Thing up in 2018, there was this defensiveness of why do we need to treat the women differently? Or why do we need to treat women preferentially? Even better. And I was like, it's really interesting that's what you've heard, because that's not what anyone has said.
Yes.
So again, to your point of the emotion comes flooding in and people hear things that you're not saying.
Yeah.
Literally, they hear things that you're not saying. So there I am on this government board saying no, not preferentially, differently, because you wouldn't treat a 14-year-old prisoner like an 85-year-old prisoner, would you? Because that would just be strange. Like, you just wouldn't do that. They have different needs. So what we're saying is, as much as you wouldn't treat a man like a woman, don't treat a woman like a man. And if we're going to provide intelligent solutions, we need to really look at what's happening here. And sorry if what we're saying therefore makes you feel defensive or uncomfortable, but can we please have a conversation about the women without everyone going, what about the men? And men suffer trauma too, because that's just really embarrassing for you, because we feel like at this level, we might not need to say that.
You hear these things, which must be utterly frustrating. And you have continued to push and push and push to almost the point where I think you went, right, that's it. I'm building it myself. You know, if you don't know
yes,
if you don't know how to reform anything, I'm literally going to get some bricks and cement, right? And I'm going to put them on top of each other and I'm going to show you how it's done.
Do you know, I've got a photograph of me putting a brick on top of another brick.
There you go. You went and you built, and we go full circle back to your doorways, back to Hope Street, which is actually something that is real. It's a tangible residential community for women and children. And I saw such amazing images on the website and the scenes and the welcoming page and space and everything. Tell me about Hope Street and how that started, because it must have been just born out of the fact that you knew what needed to happen. So you did it.
Yeah. So that government board I was talking about, in 2018, the Female Offender Strategy was published. In that strategy, there was about 53 recommendations or something. One of the recommendations, which we had obviously called for as a board, was we need the places in the community for the women, because going back to what I was talking to you about earlier, is if there aren't the places in the community, the magistrates have very little choice but to send people to prison because there's no safe places in the community. So I was like, right, well, if there's no safe places in the community, then it strikes me that we need to put the safe places in the community. And what if we created a place where those safe places, women could be sentenced to them on their community sentence because they don't require prison, because their crime does not warrant a prison sentence? What if they could be sentenced with their children?
Yeah. So you don't have that caring issue that we were talking about as well.
Yeah. If there are abusers in their home and they can't do it there, if they're homeless, how do we stop children being taken into care unnecessarily? Well, then we need to create this community in the community, as it were. So I kind of thought, right, if politics was no issue, if money was no issue, how would we design a Rolls-Royce version of this? And I don't mean by spending loads of money on materials. I mean the Rolls-Royce version as in, how would you really think through every element of it? The referral routes, how would it work with the judiciary? Do we need to change laws? How would it work with the police? How would they refer in? How would it work with the prisons? And how would it work with the probation service? Could we even make this work? Then once we'd worked out what it was we needed to do, what did we need to design to make it work in the best way that it could? So architectural design. How many buildings would we need? Is it just one? Is it 10? Over what geographical space? So we did all that. And then if we put a business plan around it, is this going to break the bank, or do we think this is actually something that we could fund and get going? So we did all of that work. It's called Hope Street, Hampshire, because it sits over a county. It's replicable, scalable model so that you could pick the model up out of Hampshire and put it in any other shire. It would therefore work in the same way with the police, probation, judiciary, and prisons in every county. So you're just doing the same thing over and over again. And what you're doing, therefore, is reducing the number of women being sent to prison for their own safety by providing the safe alternative.
On top of all of that, am I right in saying when we were having dinner that evening, you mentioned that it is more cost effective than what's happening today?
Oh, a lot. So on average, it costs £10,000 a year to keep someone at Hope Street per head. And it's 48 to 50 for a woman.
In the normal prison community?
In a prison, yeah. And a youth offender is actually £110,000 a year to keep a youth offender inside. For a woman, it's about 48 to 50,000 pounds a year.
And Hope Street is 10,000.
Roughly 10,000.
Yeah.
I mean, I should point out we're in the pilot phase of Hope Street. We're being evaluated by Southampton University, a big 5-year evaluation, because we have to, it's right that we need to evaluate it, but I sometimes going to go, well, evaluate the fact that it's better to treat people humanely and prevent them from going into prison when they shouldn't be there, and to prevent their children from being removed from them unnecessarily. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll prove that's better.
We'll prove that's better. We'll do those. We'll do the tick boxing so that we can all get to the same page. And it's going to take 5 years to do that.
Yeah. And £500,000, by the way, on the evaluation that's all being fundraised for. We keep sending people to prison, even though we absolutely do know and have known for decades that it's not working. But the evaluation doesn't sort of count that way around, does it?
No.
It only counts for people who are trying to sort of do good in the country.
Dell Technologies are passionate champions of small businesses. They recognise that it can be a lonely road, and so they have the Dell Women's Entrepreneur Network, or DWEN for short, which is a worldwide community of over 100,000 female founders. They run free events and mentoring programs and have a network of brilliant women all connecting and sharing insight. They also recognise that for many small businesses, visibility is one of the biggest challenges they face when trying to reach new customers. So each week, Dell give away their ad break space. So now I'm going to hand over to this week's winner of Dell's Independent Ad Break.
Don't tell me you're funny. Make me laugh. Look, this is what I say all the time when it comes to sustainability and business. If we're not doing it, then we are greenwashing. My business, Ape, has been working for 35 years to help companies develop, articulate and deliver better environmental strategies, whether that be small, tiny retailers, whether that be medium-sized organisations, or whether that be blue-chip companies. We've saved our clients £160 million annually, and mostly we absolutely love what we do. Sustainability. We help people paint a picture of a better future, whether that be economically, socially, or environmentally. This is creativity. It's just imagining a world that hasn't arrived yet. We help you imagine one, then we help you deliver one. Get in touch at thisisape.co.uk.
Thank you, Del, for your support and generosity. If you'd like to find out more about Dwen and connect with brilliant and inspiring women, or you'd like to be in with a chance to have your very own ad break here on this series, head to holly.co/Del. Now, back to this week's conversation of inspiration. I just literally could talk to you forever. We're talking about Hope Street, and we're talking about that period of time where you can get them not going into the prison system, not having their children removed, all of these sorts of things. We're talking about a community that's only 3,800. So when they have come out of prison and they find themselves on the other side of Hope Street, or the other side of prison, tell me about what life is like for the majority of women leaving. So now you served your time. I can only imagine that having that badge as being inside does not make life any better, must make it worse.
Yeah.
And it was pretty bad to start with.
Yeah, so either women leave homeless, that's the majority. As I said, they are given tents, and that is no secret in the prison service, but it appears it's a big national secret to anyone who I talk to whose eyes come out of their heads. Or they go back to abusive partners. And then that annoying phrase that people come out with, why don't they just leave? And it's like, what, to go to their second house in the Cotswolds? Leave? Leave to go where? Like, a lot of these women come out without even £2 in their bank account. Some of them don't have a bank account. They don't have clothes. It's like, sorry, go where? Where are people, a genuine question, where are people expecting these women to go when they can't even afford a taxi or a train fare or virtually a bus fare? So what happens? They get picked up by the drug dealers that circle the prisons. And of course they go with them. And of course they take drugs because they're traumatized and they're scared and they're homeless. So, at Hope Street, it's very important that we go to the prison gates to pick up any of the women who are coming to us, because we have to make sure that we get them from the prison gate. Because some prisons, there's a bit of a walk between the prison gate and the train station, and most of the women don't get to the train station because they get picked up before they go.
I'm just finding this so extraordinary, what you're saying. I find it literally mind-boggling that no one knows this information, or I'm just super uneducated about this subject. I can't even... drug dealers are circling women leaving prison. Never knew that.
Yeah, so another really good example to put the gender part into perspective. I remember being at Brixton Prison with the then governor, and his office overlooked the gate. And there was a man leaving, grey tracksuit, bag over shoulder. He's heading out the gates. And we have a clink also in Brixton Prison, so it's a prison I know really well. And it is very normal, and the governor and I were sort of reflecting on this, for the man to leave. Okay, sure. Some men leave, there's no one there, and they disappear off.
Mm-hmm.
It's not easy for them sometimes. But it's not that strange to see a girlfriend standing there with maybe the mother of that male prisoner and the kids. The kids are dressed, they're still going to school, and the man, rejoins his family, and the house has been kept going because all the women are at home sort of doing their thing. When women leave prison, there's very often nobody, or the pimp, or the gang leader, drug dealer is waiting. Guess what? There's no multi-generational scene of boyfriend or husband with the children, clothed, still going to school, with a father figure standing there. And actually, when you put it like that, you kind of you think how ludicrous that would be to see.
Yeah.
The boyfriend and the dad and the children all with the men having kept the home going while the woman was in prison. Like, that does not happen. So when I'm in the women's prisons, there was a woman, because once the sentence has finished, you're required by law for that person to be removed off Crown property, right? Because prisons are Crown property. So women often don't want to leave the prison because they're scared, because what they're going out to is too awful to think about. So they either don't leave the properties, then the police have to be called to get them off prison property. This happened to a woman I was working with in Style. And so she got removed by the police, and she sat on her suitcase in the middle of the road in order to be hit by a car. She got hit by the car. She went to hospital, came back to prison.
Because it was safer there.
Yeah. And the women will often say, well, I don't want to go, so I know what I'm going to do when I get out so that I can come back in. The governors will say, you could let the walls down of the women's prisons. They won't want to go.
Jesus.
Reflecting then again on the men coming out and popping the champagne.
Yeah.
You didn't see any women doing that, did you?
No.
Now, I'm not saying that women might not do that, but there's a real trying to, I can't emphasize enough.
You're
this
doing
isn't about men versus women, women versus men. Like, the system is in crisis for everybody. The children, the old people, the men, the women, everybody, and the babies who are dying. But in order to come up with sensible, thoughtful solutions, which I believe Hope Street is, you need a sort of level of sophistication in the way you're thinking about these things. And, you know, if we're not going to be honest about what the reality is, then you can't come up with the solutions. And I fear that's what we've seen over decades, which is why I was like, right, I'm going to build my own system, because I can't change that system.
Yeah.
We do also work inside the walls, by the way, but that is really hard. And when they want to kick you out, they just kick you out. And when they want to withdraw your funding, they just withdraw your funding, which is what they do to us. So then I'm like, well, what they can't do, they can't get their hands on Hope Street.
No, they can't.
I mean, they can prevent us from getting any money from them. We want to work in conjunction with them. You know, there's lots of people I really like and respect in both the Ministry of Justice and in the prisons. You know, there's some fantastic people around. But I wanted to see if I could design my own system and to see if I couldn't roll that out in order to reduce the number of people being sent to prison, because then the magistrates actually have a credible, sensible, thought through solution.
Absolutely.
But we are fundraising for it. You know, I had to raise the money to design it, to build it, to do the thinking. We're fundraising to operate it. And it's really hard to do good, you know, in this country. It's a real daily battle.
What keeps you going, Edwina? Why are you committed? It feels like you're coming into your own now. 25 years, you literally put the bricks on top of one another. You're creating your own system. It feels like you're talking more publicly. I've listened to you on the radio. I've listened. It's like you're like, gloves off now, everyone.
Do you know what? I feel like I'm at that point.
Yeah.
I'm in my 40s. I care a lot less.
Yeah.
I do have 25 years of experience behind me.
You're an expert.
I've got 2 degrees in this area. I'm academically interested in it, as well as, you know, working in it practically from a donor's point of view, from a charitable point of view, from a chairperson, a founder. So I've worked in the Houses of Parliament, in the House of Lords. I've worked with the MOJ. So I feel like I've got this really interesting 360-degree view. I can't be sacked by anyone. I'm not interested in being a politician. I've got little to lose. I've got everything to gain for the people that I work for.
Yeah.
And you kind of think, well, if I'm going to get into trouble for being honest and saying it as it is,
bring it on.
It's perhaps better to just give that a go, because everything I've done in the last 25 years hasn't really cut through. As I've said to you, you know, yes, there's been a few media articles recently. There was a big thing that the Times did, because the Times are running the Justice Times Commission, which will be interesting. The report's out in the spring. But yeah, it feels like I do have to put myself into a place that I don't particularly want to go into, which is being more public about this.
Thank God it's got you, though. I literally posted on stories last night. I was looking at Kate Winslet, and she's obviously becoming more and more of a phenomenal actress. And what I loved about her and her interviews gives me such strength is watching the power of her not giving a shit and actually watching the power of a woman who has been, like most women, restrained in different, I'm not talking about those who find themselves in prison. I'm talking about just women generally, finding ourselves constrained by all the things, how we should behave, what we should do, all of these. And as we get older, if you do take that path, I find it so inspiring, because by you opening up and taking it on and saying, you know what, come on then. I've got my 25 years. Kate, she's got her X amount of years in her profession. Just, it doesn't matter anymore what you think, what you say. I'm doing it. You've not listened before. You're not going to listen. So I'm going to now have to go and prove it.
Yeah.
And that strength of a woman, when they hit that moment, find it electric.
Yeah.
Electric, because so many people are going to get strength from hearing what you're saying. Not only have they heard the statistics, they've understood it more, there's more empathy. Think about how many people listening to this now or listening to your radio shows, interviews, will go and talk about what you're exposing, because actually the majority of us do believe that they want to give second chances to those, again, those who we would deem should have a second chance. Listening to your story about women walking up the path and they don't want to leave prison. They're safer in prison.
Yeah.
That's maybe time that they've never had that's so safe, consecutive days that they've been so safe. It is absolutely astronomical.
Yeah. They're away from the abuse. And, and people will misunderstand it going, well, that's because prisons are holiday camps. I've had that before.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, it's because the abuse that they suffer on the outside is really terrible, and they're not suffering that when they're in a prison. It's a break. It's a break from it. So again, it's just, it's the education piece.
Well, I'm
it.
So happy you've hit that point, because I can feel it. I've listened to it's just unbelievable, and I'm right behind you. Tell me about, if this has been a roller coaster. I liken the journeys of my guests to the roller coaster. In the lowest moment on that roller coaster, feeling a bit sick in your stomach, what would that have been as a moment to you?
Well, I was thinking about this, and I think it's not like one moment, because obviously when you work in prisons, there's lots of just everyday sort of, and you have to be okay with a certain level of depressing stuff happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's what we've talked about a bit. It's having to try so hard, and you're fighting this invisible force where everyone is saying that we know what it is we need to do, but then no one really doing it. And then sort of being like, no, it's like that piece that doesn't make sense of, right, well, you said you need the places in the community. Well, here you go. Okay, I've designed it. I've built it. Right. Well, there's no funding for it. Well, okay, so I'm just going to fundraise and carry on. Wait, but you said that that's what you needed as a government, and subsequent governments have, agreed. So I think for me, it's that constant rumbling of it not quite taking off and flying. And maybe I'm impatient because it only opened a year and a half ago.
Well,
so
I mean,
I am impatient, but it shouldn't be this hard to do good. It shouldn't be this hard.
No, it should not.
So that's the low. That's just like the constant
continuous
rumbling
low, really. A continuous low. And tell me, what would be a moment that you would say has been a greatest high on this journey?
It probably was the day I opened Hope Street, because it felt like my life had gone full circle. And for a long time, I didn't have a name for Hope Street. And I thought one day I'll just know what it is. And because I make a lot of speeches, and people always say, where did it start for you? And I always say it started on Hope Street.
Yeah.
And so one day I was like, oh, Hope Street, that's a good name. And also it works quite well.
Yeah.
So I think people think it's like that cheesy, it gives people hope. And it's like, well, no, I'm not that cheesy. So I opened Hope Street, and the team were around me. There were some women that we already had living at Hope Street. And I wrote my dissertation actually when I did my undergrad in criminology and sociology. I wrote my dissertation on children being removed from prisons, from their mothers in prison. And we got our first mother and baby out of prison around the time that we opened. And when I saw that little baby in a baby grow running across the courtyard garden at Hope Street just after we'd opened, I wasn't expecting it, but that like hit me like a truck in a good way. It wasn't staring at the buildings going, look at what we've built. It was like seeing that little nappy hanging out at the bottom of a baby crow that wasn't done up properly. And that mother and that baby had come directly from prison to us. And the baby was learning how to sleep in a bed for the first time. And she was playing with the flowers.
Unbelievable.
So for me, that was kind of like my younger self coming crashing back into me.
Yeah.
In a way that I hadn't expected and wasn't really.
You hadn't, no. Because really, actually, this whole thing, Edwina, is you've not been thinking at all about yourself for 25 years. This has been about the spirit of that baby, of that mother across the world, across this country, and what you could do for it, and how grateful we are for you, because no one else is doing it. And so you feel that responsibility and you literally are taking it on. I have enjoyed this podcast so much, Edwina. I was wondering, we were just talking about the younger you just there crashing back on you. And I was wondering if you would do us the honor of reading a letter to your younger self at this point in the podcast.
Yes, I certainly will. Dear Edwina, I know it's hard to hear, but not everyone is as interested in prisons as you. I know, you don't believe me, and I know you are appalled that I may say such a thing, but it is true. It just is. It's okay for people not to share your passion, and actually it's okay for them to not even be remotely interested. Your work is going to take a lifetime. There will be no real destination. So keep going, don't change course, you'll get there in the end. It will help if you make sure you move away from the negative and gravitate towards the positive in life. Radiators, not drains. People who fill you up and don't drag you down. Do take time to swim in the sea, walk in the woods, and remember you need to recharge every now and again. Oh, and don't feel guilty about that. Remember to move at your own speed and not others. Don't get angry when people seem to be more interested in your family than your work. That's okay. It just is what it is. Move on. There's too much work to be done to sweat the small stuff. Oh, and never write anything bad about anyone in an email. You will inevitably send it to that person in error. Good luck and enjoy banging your head against a brick wall in all that you do, because you'll be doing it for many years to come. Love, your elder self.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I really laughed writing that.
It takes someone like you, though. It takes to advocate for people to be able to cope with banging your head against a brick wall every single day. And if anyone is going to do it, you're going to do it, because you're our hope. And never forget that. And I can't thank you enough for that letter to your younger self and for everything that you're doing for us. You're an inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me today. If you've enjoyed this episode, can I ask that you share it with a friend and like, subscribe and review it too, so that together we can inspire even more people to follow their dreams, to build a life they love.